Salutations, gentle viewers. This is George from Ireland, and in this video I'm bidding farewell to Senator John McCain of happy and beloved memory. So it was only today that news broke that Senator McCain has passed into the ages. Well, anyone watching this video will probably know a little bit about him. You may be aware he was 88 years old, and perhaps unusually for a leading American politician, he was born in Panama, because the Panama Canal Zone was controlled by the United States, is still, I believe. His father and his grandfather before him were admirals in the US Navy. He followed in his father's footsteps. John McCain did, training as a US naval officer, and he was part of the Fleet Air Arm, if that's what you call it. So he's a naval aviator, and he served with distinction in Vietnam. So not all my younger viewers will have heard of the Vietnam conflict, but anyway, in the 60s, the United States was fighting in Vietnam, propping up the South Vietnamese government, which was fighting against the communist insurgency and the communist government of North Vietnam as part of the Cold War. So John McCain was shot down on his 23rd bombing mission over North Korea. Now, many military personnel simply follow orders, and they don't give any thought to the rights and the wrongs of things. But McCain was different, and he pondered the ethics of this war deeply, and he was a convinced Cold Warrior. So he believed his cause was one of rectitude, and the North Vietnamese were not welcoming towards those who'd been bombing them. Now, there's a Geneva Convention that's to be observed. There are certain minimum standards for treatment of prisoners of war. But the United States hadn't declared war on North Vietnam. Perhaps that's the reason this happened. Much of it was an irregular conflict, which tends to lower standards of chivalry. I'm not naive. I think even in a conventional conflict, soldiers do not always love their enemies and do not always treat them decently. But anyway, in this war, prisoners were usually treated badly, sometimes abominably. And John McCain was tortured many times. I don't think even the most stalwart communist would dispute that. And his arm broken many times, such as one arm was considerably shorter than the other. So he was held in dreadful conditions in North Vietnam. And he was offered to be released early, but he refused. He said, "No, I'll stay with my comrades." I don't know how on earth he did it. Had I been in his position, there's no way. I would have been going home. Plus, he's married, he had children. He could have salved his conscience with saying, "Well, I have a duty to them. I'm not serving my country by staying here longer than I need to be." Anyway, he was once forced to make an anti-American broadcast, and he was constantly recriminating himself having done that. So he was brought up as a Christian in the Protestant denomination and was a fervent believer in Jesus. And he said that his faith sustained him through many a dark hour in captivity. And he recalled one time how he was tied up in a very uncomfortable position for hours, and a guard came along and loosened his ropes a little bit and drew a cross with his foot in the mud to signal, "I'm a Christian too," which is why I'm showing you this act of clemency. But eventually he had to tighten up the ropes because he was going off duty and somebody else was coming along, and he'd scrubbed out the cross in the mud with his foot. And I remember seeing McCain relate that vignette to an evangelical Christian audience at Forest Lake. It was during the 2008 presidential campaign, and there was the most tremendous applause from his hearers, because Christian fundamentalists simply lap up such tales of compassion, thinking that Christianity actuates people to act in a more ethical, merciful manner. Anyway, so he was released, and he soon got into Republican politics. He was out of the military, and he was elected to Congress in 1982, if I remember rightly, for Arizona. And latterly, I think it was 1987, that Barry Goldwater stood down, the celebrated senator from Arizona as well, who'd been the 1964 Republican presidential candidate. "In your heart, you know he's right." That was a slogan. Or as others said, "In your guts, you know he's nuts," as his enemy said. What else about Goldwater? Wouldn't find a home in the Republican Party today. Fairly across-the-board libertarian, but a Cold War hawk. Just like McCain was a Cold War hawk, though McCain was more interventionist and authoritarian in other areas of life. For instance, Goldwater had been pro-abortion, whereas McCain was very much against on religious grounds. So McCain, he railed against the influence of big money in politics, corporations, special interests, and indeed trade unions, skewing the political process as he saw it. However, he did take these donations, despite demanding campaign finance reform. Some people said that was the height of hypocrisy. He said, well, there was simply no other way to get into Congress. Sadly, I reflect he's right. Unfortunately, there seems to be little progress in preventing these hefty donations being made and the malign influence it has on politics. So he sought the Republican nomination in the year 2000, and the establishment candidate was George W. Bush, then governor of Texas. So McCain's insurgent candidacy went quite far, and he was the second most popular. He won some states. He said that all sorts of dirty tricks were against him. And I remember him confronting George W. Bush, said, fight your own policy, but don't take me on my personal issues. That really hurts. But anyway, getting down and dirty certainly worked for George Bush Jr. However, when Bush was elected, McCain was loyal to him. When it came to 9/11, his response was typically bellicose. This is McCain. And as for the liberation of Iraq, he was foursquare behind that. Yes, we absolutely need to do it. And when the US military presence in Iraq became rather unpopular in the United States, he said, no, we stay the course, we do not cut and run. And he was seeking, this is right after 2008, he was seeking the nomination for the Republican Party. And his popularity had sagged in 2006. Some people were saying just instant withdrawal, even if we leave it to turmoil, even if we let the Iranians occupy it. Let's just get out of there. But no, he stuck to his guns, and actually he became more popular. He won the nomination and he stood against Obama. So Joe Lieberman, the Democrats' vice presidential candidate from 2000, he gave his imprimatur to McCain and campaigned with him, saying this war on terror, it needs to be fought to a victorious conclusion, and that's it, and there's no easy way around it. We don't dress it up. So I don't think even McCain's worst foe would doubt his sincerity. But his mind was slipping, and he was mixing up Sunni and Shia and things like that. He admitted he knew little about economics, and there was that October 2008 economic crash, the credit crunch, and his relative economic illiteracy was to cost him dear. Count against him, he suspended his campaign to try and go to Congress and thrash out some stimulus package. And probably his fatal error was to pick Sarah Palin as his running mate, because he was an old man, so let's choose a relatively young woman. And that's that, a complete political unknown. I know she's governor of Alaska, it's one of the smallest populations in the United States. And his campaign was transformed. There was a big boost to his poll numbers in the short term. People scrutinized her more over the coming weeks. And her jaw-dropping ignorance meant that the campaign was a laughingstock. Had it not been for that, had he picked a more credible candidate, perhaps he would have won. Questions were asked about his health. He was 78. Would he be incapacitated during the term if he was elected, or a second term? Would she be president? And they did not want someone who was such an ignoramus having her hands on the levers of power. In the end, it wasn't to be, and Obama won. So he was ever the gentleman, McCain, and he congratulated Obama in a characteristically courteous fashion, and that was that. And his interventions in politics were not very many. He was anti-racist, and he adopted a Bangladeshi daughter. Way back in '99, he said that the Confederate flag was a symbol of racism and slavery. And that was quite a brave position to hold within the Republican Party, which had a lot of support from the former Confederacy, and quite a few Republican voters had leanings in that direction. So McCain simply loathed Trump, and the feeling was mutual. He had open contempt for Trump for being really the opposite of everything he stood for, a complete shyster, totally unpatriotic, totally egotistical, having no sense of duty, only being out for himself, being utterly dishonest, completely dishonorable, untrustworthy, despicable, vile, ungentlemanly. Everything one hoped a president wouldn't be. Someone who had no regard for the Constitution, things like that. So McCain, he was quixotic, I suppose, in holding to these old-fashioned virtues and voting to keep the Affordable Care Act, which was surprising since he'd opposed it when it came in, but he thought the alternative wasn't good enough. The area was being treated for brain cancer the past couple of years, and people like him would be thrown off their care if such an act were to pass. So anyway, there's been a sad degeneration in the grand old party, the Republicans, because McCain, well, even his most implacable enemy, would be obliged to acknowledge that he said what he believed. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity, and look how things have turned out now. I think his shining example of probity is one the Republican Party would now do well to study.